Lena had always dreamed of the stage, the bright lights, the applause, but life had a different script for her. By day, she worked tirelessly at small roles, hoping one would turn into something bigger. By night, she hid behind a mask, playing the part of a struggling actress while secretly living a life few would believe. Married to billionaire Daniel Pierce, a man she barely knew before their arranged wedding, she kept her identity hidden. He was everything she wasn't: cold, powerful, untouchable. He believed their marriage was simply a business deal, a way to unite two powerful families. But Lena knew the truth. This wasn't just about wealth. It was about the sacrifices she made to protect a love that was forced upon her, yet somehow, despite it all, felt real. The world thought Lena was just another face in the crowd, chasing a dream that would never come true. But the truth was, she wasn't just fighting for a career. She was fighting to keep her world from crumbling, to protect the secret that could destroy everything she had. This wasn't just a love story. It was a story of trust, betrayal, and the desperation to find herself again in a life that wasn't hers. Can Lena ever truly have the life she desires? Or will she always be caught between the woman she's pretending to be and the woman she was forced to become? 5 years ago, Lena had been just another struggling actress, her hopes still wrapped in the innocence of unfulfilled dreams. Daniel Pierce, on the other hand, had been untouchable, a billionaire heir with a reputation for cold business deals and distant relationships. They met at an event that was nothing more than a formal gathering, two worlds colliding by chance. He was everything she wasn't: powerful, controlled, and utterly uninterested in the glittering world of entertainment. Their first meeting was brief, a handshake that lasted seconds but left a mark on her. His gaze was sharp, but his words were few. Lena had laughed it off, thinking it would be just another encounter to forget, but she hadn't counted on the way he watched her from across the room that night. Something about her made him curious, almost vulnerable in his own way. His guarded exterior hid the struggles she didn't yet understand. It wasn't until weeks later that they met again, this time in a more private setting. He'd sought her out after seeing her perform in a low-budget play. His interest in her wasn't romantic at first, it was business. But somewhere between their conversations, the lines blurred. The moments they shared felt like stolen glimpses of something more, something neither of them wanted to admit. One evening, they stood beneath the soft glow of the city lights, a rare moment of quiet between them. Lena had been talking about her hopes, her dreams for the future, and how she felt trapped in the roles she played. Daniel listened with an intensity she wasn't used to. When their eyes met, it was as if they were no longer in the world of masks and expectations. For the first time, Lena saw the man behind the wealth, the man who wasn't afraid to dream, but terrified of letting anyone in. But everything shifted when his family stepped in. His marriage to her was a decision he never had control over, a union designed to serve business interests. She hadn't expected him to love her. She barely understood why he even agreed to marry her at all. It wasn't until their wedding day that she realized how far apart their worlds really were. In the years that followed, Lena tried to forget the brief moments of tenderness they once shared, the hope she held on to that maybe, just maybe, he'd come to see her as more than just a pawn. But Daniel's absence grew larger with time, the emotional distance between them becoming a physical wall she couldn't climb over. He saw her as little more than his wife in title, and she had to play the part. Still, she couldn't shake the memory of that night beneath the lights, when everything seemed possible, when forever had felt real. And as she stood on the edge of a career-defining moment, she wondered, was it too late for them? Had he already forgotten the man he once was? Or was she the one holding on to a dream that would never be? Lena stared at herself in the mirror, the bright stage lights blinding her as she adjusted her costume. She had grown used to playing roles, to being someone else, but today felt different. Every line, every word felt heavier. She was about to make a decision that could shatter the life she'd built, or worse, destroy the one thing she could never get back, her connection with Daniel. The marriage had been a mistake, or had it? She'd convinced herself it was nothing more than a business arrangement, a sacrifice she made for a chance at security. But now, after years of silence and distance, something in her heart refused to let go of the small spark that had once burned brightly. It was still there, flickering beneath the weight of all their unresolved emotions, a reminder of what could have been. Her phone buzzed, a text message from her agent about the latest audition. Yet all she could think about was the meeting she'd had with Daniel earlier that week. His coldness was palpable, the words he'd spoken sharp like broken glass. "You need to focus on your career," he had told her. "I don't need you to be anything more than my wife on paper." But it wasn't just about the marriage anymore. Lena had learned the hard way that their worlds were too far apart. He had a life, one filled with expectations, obligations, and family pressures she could never understand. He couldn't escape the shadows of his father's legacy. And every time he looked at her, she saw the weight of his regret and his fear of truly letting anyone in. Daniel, on the other hand, couldn't stop thinking about her. He hadn't expected to feel anything at all. Their marriage, arranged to settle family debts and obligations, was meant to be nothing more than a convenient alliance. But somewhere along the way, he'd let her in. He'd trusted her with his vulnerabilities, his deepest fears, and for a moment, he'd let himself believe there could be something real between them. But now, with every passing day, he was drowning in the demands of his family and the expectations of the life he was born into. He watched her from across the room, her face lit by the spotlight, and a familiar ache filled his chest. He wasn't just any man. He was the heir to a legacy that demanded sacrifices. His father's expectations had carved his path long before he ever met Lena. His place in the world was already decided for him, but that didn't make the pain of losing her any less. The truth was, he couldn't give her what she needed: love, time, honesty. He could barely give himself any of those things. And every time he saw her, he was reminded of the promises he had broken, of the woman he had married without truly knowing her, and of the life he'd forced her to live behind closed doors. Why did I marry her? He asked himself late at night, his mind clouded with regrets. He wasn't sure anymore. Maybe it was duty, maybe it was because of the woman she was, or maybe it was because, in some strange way, he needed her more than he could admit. But no matter how many times he tried to pull away, his heart kept pulling him back to her. And as their paths began to cross more frequently in the press and in public, he realized he couldn't keep pretending the distance didn't hurt. Lena wasn't just his wife on paper. She was the woman who had once believed in him. But now, all he could offer her was a cold, distant version of himself. As Lena walked off stage, her thoughts mirrored his. Could they ever truly be together again? Could they fight the forces that had kept them apart? Or was their love destined to remain a fleeting memory of what might have been? The rain was relentless, pounding against the windows of the luxurious penthouse, creating a rhythm that matched the rapid beating of Lena's heart. She stood by the door, the sound of his footsteps drawing closer, each step a reminder of the distance between them, both physical and emotional. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading for months, maybe even years. Tonight, everything would change. Daniel walked in, his soaked suit dripping onto the marble floor. He didn't even look at her. His eyes were clouded with something she couldn't quite read: anger, regret, guilt. She wasn't sure anymore, but all she knew was that the man who stood before her was not the man she had once hoped for, the man who had whispered promises to her in the quiet of their first days together. "Lena," he said, his voice low, hoarse. "I don't want this anymore." Her breath caught in her throat. The words sliced through her, and yet, somewhere deep inside, she knew it was coming. They'd been drifting for too long, both of them caught in lives they didn't choose. She hadn't expected him to fight for her. Not anymore. He had made it clear long ago that his world would never change for her. She turned to face him, her eyes burning with unshed tears. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, the weight of years of silence pressing down on them. Her chest ached as she looked at him, at the man who had once made her believe in love, only to pull away when it became too much. She'd been patient, silent, and compliant, but tonight she couldn't stay silent any longer. "Tell me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Tell me you never loved me, and I will walk away forever." His face paled, and for the first time in years, she saw a flicker of emotion, a flash of something real beneath the mask he wore every day. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He couldn't even look her in the eye. The seconds felt like hours. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. He knew she was waiting for him to say it, to give her the reason to walk away, to free her from the torment of loving a man who would never choose her. But in that moment, Daniel was torn between two truths: the truth he had been living and the truth he had been running from all along. He began, but the words caught in his throat. His breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled to find the right thing to say, the words that would justify the destruction of everything they had been. Lena stood there, waiting, her eyes locked on him. She could feel the weight of his indecision, the conflict that had been brewing inside of him for so long. And for the first time, she realized how much he had been hiding from her. Not just the truth of his feelings, but the truth of himself. The man she had once loved was buried beneath layers of guilt, shame, and expectations that he couldn't escape. "I can't," he finally whispered, his voice breaking. A tear slipped down Lena's cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. She had waited too long for him to say those words, to make that choice, but now that they were out in the open, she wasn't sure if she could live with them. "Then why are we still here?" she asked, her voice barely audible. His chest tightened as he looked at her, his mind spinning with all the reasons why they couldn't be together. His family, his legacy, the life he had built without her. It was all too much to throw away. But in that moment, as the rain pounded against the windows, he realized that none of it mattered anymore. Not the money, not the legacy, not the family expectations. It was her. It had always been her. "I never stopped loving you," he confessed, his voice raw. "But I didn't know how to love you without destroying you." Lena's heart trembled as she took a step forward, her mind racing with the weight of his words. She had spent years wondering if he felt anything for her, and now, in this moment of truth, she was faced with a choice of her own. Could she forgive him? Could she rebuild everything they had destroyed? The silence between them was deafening as the storm raged on outside. Everything was at stake: her heart, her future, their love. The question remained: was it too late for them, or could they finally find a way back to each other? With one final glance at the man who had once been her everything, Lena made her decision. "Then let's stop running," she said quietly, her voice steady for the first time in years. "Let's start over." The days that followed were nothing like Lena had imagined. Their reunion wasn't as simple as picking up where they left off. There were long silences, tense conversations, and moments where they both questioned whether they were truly ready to rebuild what had been broken. But they both knew one thing: they could no longer live in the shadows of their past. Lena spent her days in the city, working on her career, stepping into roles that challenged her, that allowed her to explore parts of herself she'd long buried. The world now knew her not just as the struggling actress, but as a woman who had fought for her dreams, for her independence. She was no longer just the woman who had been Daniel's wife on paper. She was Lena, a force in her own right. But in the quiet moments, she thought of him. Daniel, the man who had once been a stranger, who had once hurt her more than she could have imagined, but who had finally come to realize that the life he had been living wasn't enough. He had changed in his own way, but the scars of their past still remained. Their paths continued to cross, unexpectedly, sometimes in public, sometimes in private, and each time, their connection felt stronger. But the weight of their shared history was never far from the surface. The tension between them had shifted, less about the hurt and more about the uncertain future ahead. One evening, as they sat together on a park bench, the soft glow of streetlights casting long shadows around them, Lena turned to him. His face was less guarded now, the lines of worry and regret beginning to soften, replaced by something she hadn't seen in years: hope. "I never thought I'd be here with you," she said quietly, her voice filled with an emotion she could barely name. "After everything, I thought I'd be the one walking away. But now..." Daniel reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers gently. "I never wanted to lose you, Lena. I just didn't know how to be the man you needed. But I'm trying. I'm trying to be better. For you. For us. Her heart swelled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. There was still so much they had to work through, so many years of missed opportunities and unspoken feelings to reconcile. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like they were on the same path, not as two separate people trying to force a connection, but as partners. Flawed, yes, but willing to try again. Lena didn't say anything for a moment. She simply squeezed his hand, letting the silence between them speak for itself. She knew their future wasn't guaranteed and that there would be more challenges ahead. But in that moment, she could see something she hadn't seen in years, an open door, a chance to move forward, together. As they sat in the quiet of the evening, surrounded by the buzz of the city, Lena couldn't help but smile. She had fought for her dreams, for herself, and now, for the first time, she realized that maybe she didn't have to choose between love and ambition. Maybe, just maybe, they could have both. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy, but Lena knew that the road they would walk together would be one of growth, of healing, and of love that, though tested, was still very much alive. Is love enough to heal the wounds of the past? Can two people who once lost everything find their way back to each other, even after all the pain and time apart? Sometimes, love isn't about perfect endings. It's about having the courage to try again, to take that step forward, even when the future feels uncertain. What would you do if love offered you a second chance? Would you take it or let it slip away once more? She's fighting for her big break on stage, but behind the curtain, she's living a secret life, one that could change everything. What if the woman you see struggling every day is actually married to the one man who owns the world? And what if he has no idea the life she's been hiding from him? Stay with us, because in the end, nothing is what it seems.